Welcome everyone to RPG Freeform in a nutshell. You can see the handout download I've got on this chart. There's also a couple of alternative handout downloads that John Harris, who's sitting in the background, playing a big role in this and a bigger role later on, will be able to supply additional help for any handout issues if you have trouble getting it or anything like that. So we would like to ask that if you have any questions on content, about, I don't understand what that keyword is or something like that, probably best answered, put into the Q&A panel. If you have questions that are more administrative, like I'm having trouble with getting the handout, or I can't hear, or something like that, those kind of things are best handled in the chat. And John Paris is in the background. He will be answering your questions. I'm not going to attempt to answer questions myself during the session because it's very, very short time we have here. But John will probably be able to do at least as good a job, if not better than I would, in answering those questions for you in the background in the Q&A. So feel free to go ahead and put them there and then watch for John's answers. So without any further ado, I will get started as soon as I get it onto the next chart. There we go. The reason we're doing this is sort of twofold, but the primary reason we decided to do this session is that for the people that are attending our Summit Deep Dive workshops, which are starting up in September, so September, a little bit into October, I think, we have a series of 13 deep dive workshops, half-day workshops. I've got them listed here. The ones that are highlighted in red are the ones that will be showing you a fair bit of Freeform, or be showing you a fair bit of RPG code examples. And all of our RPG code examples are always in Freeform. So just in case there are those of you that need a little help, perhaps understanding some of the details of Freeform, including the latest Freeform declarations and or the completely Freeform star free. So we decided we'd do this as sort of a little prereq for those people attending the workshops. And of course, decided, well, hey, it's a good thing to make it available for anybody who's interested in learning a little bit about Freeform RPG. So that's what we're doing. By the way, if you want more details about those workshops, John's going to join me here on the stage, so to speak, and we're going to go into more details about the workshops themselves. Actually, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the RPG skills that we think are essential for RPG developers these days and how those workshops will help to address some of those skills. So that will come at the end of the Freeform portion. But first, we're going to talk about Freeform RPG. And our agenda is going to look like this. Just a little bit about why Freeform is important. We'll talk a little bit about the three different levels, shall we say, of Freeform in RPG, and the rules and syntax for all three of those options. And last but certainly not least are the tools to help you convert your existing code to Freeform. Because, for the most part, there is very little, if any, reason for people to still be working with fixed form code. Even if the code was written a really long time ago, there's probably a tool out there that will help you convert that code without too much trouble. And it'll be so much easier to maintain from that point on. It'll be worth the time and effort, but talk about that near the end. Now, you've all signed in here, so I suppose talking about why, maybe I don't have to worry about that too much because maybe you're interested enough to sign in, but just to give you my impression of why Freeform is important. I've already mentioned about how much easier it is to read and write, therefore it makes it easier for even existing experienced RPG people can read the code easier than fixed form RPG, but especially for developers coming in from other languages. A lot of shops these days are getting developers in that originally were coding in Java or C# or Node or something like that. They can pick up Freeform RPG very easily. Show them the fixed form stuff and it looks so foreign that they don't usually want to know about it. Indentation, simple thing like being able to indent your nested logic and nesting levels within data structures, being able to indent that as well. Excuse me. more efficient use of space in the source code. I don't know about you, but as soon as we got even RPGLE, I hardly ever use factor one anymore. So it turns out that in fixed form code, I often just see that the area between the C and the opcode is almost always blank, and it's just a lot of wasted space. And we don't want to. Our programs are big enough. We have to scroll enough as it is. So more efficient use of space is always good. And of course, there's room for larger names. As RPGers, we're famous for not liking to have really long names on things. But it is pretty tough sometimes to come up with succinct, meaningful names in a 10, or heaven forbid, in the olden days, 6-character names. So the fact that with Freeform, we really don't have those limitations anymore is key. Perhaps the most important thing to me is the attraction of new programmers. And I kind of referred to that in point number 1 as well. Freeform looks and feels like other modern languages. I mean, it really does. I mean, at a glance, it's really tough to tell whether you're looking at a PHP script or an RPG program when they're all in Freeform. And it's that much easier for other people to understand and to learn. So I don't want my legacy discarded. If I want Freeform, if I want people to continue to maintain my code, after I'm no longer wanting to maintain that code myself, I've moved on to something else, then I would prefer to have the RPG neophytes, the folks coming along after me, to be able to maintain my code and keep it going, because I think I did a pretty good job of writing that code. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as RPGers. So just a couple of quick examples. I'm not going to attempt to teach anything from this chart and the next one. It's just a sort of quick, here's a side-by-side comparison. So first of all, I'm talking here about the declarations. You see the declarations, the old fixed form ones with the F and D specs, and then the declare afterwards. Not a huge difference other than the fact that things are just sort of move around, and with the exception of the F specs, probably a really huge difference in terms of F specs. I'm going to talk about that in a lot more detail later. When it comes to logic, which of course freeform logic has been around a lot longer. So when it comes to logic, it makes a much bigger difference, as you can see. So, having all those operation codes lined up in one column is really pretty difficult to tell where the nesting occurs, the nesting of the logic occurs. And so, being able to just indent and show that nesting of the logic, as well as just making more efficient use of the space, as I mentioned before. Here's that example of, the extra space over there between the C and the opcode. So those are the kinds of things we're talking about here, some of the big advantages. I don't want to spend a lot of time on history, but I thought it was interesting just to take a quick look at just how long ago some of this stuff happened. So those of you that are still writing, heaven forbid, hopefully not new code in fixed form, but I imagine there's probably some out there that are still doing that. That was what we had in 1994 in the beginning with RPG4. We got completely freeform logic in 2001. So we're talking 22 years ago now, long time ago. The declarations, freeform declarations, didn't happen until about 11 years later, but still we're talking over 10 years ago. So if you were just thinking, I don't want to jump into this really quickly, I'm going to take my time, I think maybe it's time that we all start taking a look at the more modern ways of writing both our logic and our data declarations. And of course, then a few years after that, we got the ability to do away with the 80-column restriction entirely, so that we have the ability to code all the way from column 1 to whatever the end of the source member is. So I'm going to go into this in detail, in all of these in a lot of detail, but I'm going to do it in reverse chronological order. And the reason for that is I figure the stuff that's been around for the longest, that is the logic, the freeform logic, is probably stuff that more people understand. So I want to, while you're fresh and paying closer attention perhaps at the beginning of the session, I'd like to concentrate on the stuff that might be newer to more of you. So we're going to start talking about star free. That's also one of the easiest in terms of the rules. Pretty cut and dried rules in that case. We'll talk about that one, the star free, no column restrictions first. We're then going to move into the free format declarations, which came in 7.1. And then at the end, I'm going to do a fairly quick overview of free format logic. And that is the stuff that we had prior to version 7. So that tells you, we'll talk about the syntax and the opcodes that are not supported, because that's a big reason why that stops a lot of people that say, I can't figure out what to do because my favorite opcode isn't supported in Freeform. So how can I deal with that? So we'll talk about some of those things. And we'll also talk about some new things that you can only do in free format logic. And last but not least, as I mentioned before, please don't think about converting all your existing code on your own manually. You've got better things to do with your time. There are tools to help, and we are going to talk about some tools that are available to help you convert your existing code. But also, of course, keep in mind as you're writing new code to be writing it in the new fixed form. Sorry, free form, not fixed form, please. So as I said, we're going to start at the very freest section. Do you want completely free format RPG? And by that, what I mean is you can start at line 1, column 1. And if you do, at that particular location, line 1, column 1 has to be the first asterisk of star free. Has to be right there. And, it can't be in column 3. It can't be on line 3. Line 1, column 1. I think it's truly ironic that it's the only thing that has to be in a specific row and column in the entire source member is the thing that says, I don't want to put things in the specific columns, but there you go. That's the way it is. So do that, put the star free right there in that first column, first line. And from that point on, after that, everything else in the source member can start at column 1, and it can continue all the way to the end of the source line. Now, of course, by default, our source lines have traditionally had 92 characters in them, but you may or may not know that source member line lengths can actually go up to 32,766 characters, which I think is probably more than enough for anybody. But if it's not, your other option is you can always store your source in the IFS, and you may want to do that for other reasons as well. So that the files there are not limited in length at all, recordly. You can see the requirements in terms of the releases and things. I'm really hoping there's nobody who's not running at least 7.1 and current TRs at this point. If the first line of source does not begin with star free, then the entire source member is considered what's to be called column limited. That is, all the code has to be within the columns 8 to 80, just as traditional RPG code has been. One thing about star free, when you have a star free member, there cannot be any non-free format statements. Okay. So if you have free format, but it's limited to 8 to 80, column limited, then you can, we prefer that you not, because it looks kind of ugly, but you can actually mix fixed form and free form logic within that same source member. You cannot do that if the member has star free at the beginning. So everything has to be free form at that point. If for some reason you have some code that you need to bring in that is not freeform, then one option available to you is to use /copy or /include, if you prefer, to bring it in at compile time. And by the way, regardless of the reason for bringing your /copies in, if your code that you're copying in, you want it to be star free as well, as in starting in column 1, then it has to specify it in the copy member itself. So in other words, the star free doesn't carry over to the copy member automatically. /free and /end free, which were required originally in the freeform logic days, the earlier days where we only had freeform logic. Those were required at one time, then they became optional. But in free members, they're not only not required, they're not allowed. So that's a pretty strict requirement there. The SQL precompiler supports free, as does RDI as of 9.5, and of course, all the other modern non-screen editors, which we'll be mentioning a little bit later as well. So just showing you a little example here of free, and that is in column 1 there, and I can start all my code now in column 1, including my /copy for my old RPG code if I need it, that has to be copied in because it has fixed form in it, or for whatever reason that I want to copy it in. So that's the free stuff. Like I said, pretty simple rules, pretty rigid rules as well. So an easy one to start with. Let's get into something that's a little more complex, and that is the Freeform declarations. Almost all RPG code can be free format now. Basically, the only thing that cannot be is there is no replacement for the I and O specs. But of course, we don't really use I and O specs very much anymore with modern RPG, so that's really not much of an issue for most shops. So we're talking about the H spec or the control spec, our file declarations, data declarations, and procedure and prototype declarations. So let's just go through and take a quick look at what those look like. This came in 7.1. So you can now specify an entire program as long as the program doesn't have any I and O specs in it. It can all now be available completely for Freeform. Starting with 7.1, you no longer need the /free or /free. It can be there unless it's a free member, as I mentioned, as I told you before. The /free and /frees can be in the code, but you know what? Take them out because they were always kind of in the way and bulky, particularly if you're using procedures and stuff. So personally, I would like to see people just kind of making their way through that code as you're editing it and take out those free and /free things, assuming that you're at 7.1 or later. So what we're talking about here, again, are the replacements for the H specs, which is the control opcode, F specs for declare F, D specs, which is a DCL and a whole bunch of other options that we're going to go through. And also the P specs have been replaced with also a DCL, but specifically the DCL proc for declare procedure. So you see a quick example here of each of those, not every single option, but we have the control opt showing up here, which is the replacement for the H spec. We have our data structure and, excuse me, with the declare DS, with its subfields, we have our file, and it's not an error here. Notice that we have a file declared after a data structure. Traditionally in RPG, that was a no-no, right? We were not allowed to do that. Now we can. And that's useful sometimes. For example, in the following the end of this example here, we have the declare file, and then right underneath that, we have the data structure that we're using that will be associated with the print line that we're writing to the printer. So, you know, things like that you can kind of group together by have the file and any other data declarations associated with that file specifically can be coded together, which is kind of nice. So let's talk about syntactically. The format of these new declarations is that the declaration opcode always comes first, just like it does in the logic. So in free format logic, the operation code always comes first. Now, when we talk about declarations, we tend not to think of them as opcodes because opcodes sound like logic. Their operation codes sound like logic, but technically they are still opcodes and they do always come first. So the control opt in place of the H spec is followed by all the keywords associated with it. If you want to declare, for example, a data structure, you would do the declare DS, as you see in the employee DS below, and then the name of the item. And then depending on, that was the DS. I forgot what I was talking about here. That was the DS for the type of the item that we're declaring. So we're declaring the data structure and then the name of the data structure itself. Obviously, there's not a name for on the control opt because we're not declaring anything. We're just talking about the control specifications. So we have our keywords, same sort of keywords that we could always use, but we're also now using keywords for our data types and sizes. So we're no longer putting stuff in a specific column to say this data type and size. We put what type it is, followed by its length. And those are now specified as keywords, as well as, of course, all the things that we could previously specify as keywords, like initialize, things like that. So those will appear as keywords. Note, of course, just like with freeform logic, for those of you that are maybe familiar with that already, we still, of course, need the semicolon at the end of all these statements. And we need an end for our data structures, which I think we'll talk about in a little more detail later. Although you'll notice, as my example down here at the bottom shows, that if it's something like an externally described data structure, then the NDS, so that we don't need those subfields listed specifically, you can put it on the same line. Should still be there, but it can be, it'll go on the same line. So here's sort of a more complete program example. So starting with our control opt, the thing that used to be our HSpec, with some data definitions, in this case, data structures, followed by, again, noticing that we can put our file definitions later. And then, of course, we have our freeform logic that follows using all of that data in those files and things like that. So the nice thing about this is that there's lots of options, not that it's just freeform. The fact that it's freeform is nice because it looks like everything else. But the more important thing is that it really does make everything far more readable, because we're not as dependent on where something is coded as to what it actually says. And so much of this information is actually spelled out via keywords instead of having to get your little, magic decoder ring out to figure out what an E in that particular column actually means on some of these specs, for example. So there's a lot of sensible defaults in use here. We're going to go through these in more detail in a moment. But things like disk files default to input, printers to output, decimals to 0. You don't have to put 0 in all the time for all of your data definitions. If it has 0 decimals, you can just put the actual length without the decimals and specified at all. And of course, the end of line comments with the 2 slashes are also quite useful. Doesn't take up as much space as putting all of your comments on a completely separate line. So let's go through each of these in more detail. Just kind of drilling down here into more and more detail about each of these things. The HSpec is the thing that probably changed the least, because our HSpec in RPGLE was already fully keyword oriented. So whereas most of our fixed form stuff moved from column oriented things to keyword oriented things, HSpec was already there. It was already keyword oriented. So there's very little change there except changing the H to a control opt. That pretty much is what you need to do. There are a few other small differences, enhancements or differences that have occurred. So for example, excuse me. If you have procedures in your code or using procedures in your code, then you have to specify, used to have to specify default activation group no. You don't have to do that anymore if you have any other ILE specific options used. So if you put the activation group name in or the binding directory name, either of which are very, very commonly used in those kinds of programs. So you no longer have to specify, you're no longer required to specify default activation group no anymore. Storage model is one that isn't used nearly as much, but that's another ILE specific related one. Other differences, of course, is that it can start anywhere from column 8 onwards, or if you're using star free, all the way from column 1 onwards. And of course, it has to have a semicolon at the end. But otherwise, the same rules apply to the control opt as the current HSpec. It can use multiple lines. It can either overflow onto multiple lines, or you could put multiple control ops in there if you want. The presence of the control op will stop the compiler looking for an HSpec data area. If you're familiar at all with that, I find most RPGers are not familiar with that. I kind of had to learn that myself because that was something that was new to me when I found out about that rule. You know, when we got freeform logic, I said to myself, this is it. You know, I'm happy they could stop here. Freeform logic, being able to indent my logic, my nested logic and stuff, that's the crux of it. That's really probably the most important thing. I was thinking in terms of my D specs and thinking, you know, declarations, is that so important? My D specs I can sort of do a little bit of freeform stuff with them in terms of the names and indenting names and data structures and things like that. I didn't think it was that critical. You know, I wasn't that sold on it was so critical to have declarations in freeform. And then we got it. And I saw the replacement for the F spec. And I fell in love. You know, it was like, wow, I never even occurred to me how much easier it is to read and write these file declarations now in freeform. I don't know about you, but I used to spend a lot of time copying F specs from one place to another because of all those little things and little columns. And, you know, rather than have to remember to put every single one of them in there, I would go and copy it from another program, which is just silly and lazy on my part, I admit. But now I can just put the keywords in, and not only do I need to do that, when I look at an F spec, I declare F as opposed to an F spec. I no longer have to assume that I understand what all that stuff means. With a declare F, it's all keywords. I can read it. Right? I've got usage. I know whether it's input or update. I know whether it's a keyed file. I know whether it's, you know, what its length is, if it's a program described file. All of those things are so obvious now. So reading, maintaining the code, which we spend a lot more time doing, but also writing this code, especially with the defaults. So as I said, if you have a database file that's just being used for input, you could just say the name of the file, and that's it, right? You could stop at that if you wanted to. If it's keyed, you want to specify keyed. If you're going to update it, you'd want to specify that, but it defaults to disk and input. So you don't necessarily have to specify those things. It's also, of course, externally described as the default. You don't have to specify that it's externally described because, heaven forbid, who would want to do anything else? Except for some rare cases, perhaps with printer files particularly. So you can put the keyword, keyword option *ext in if you want, right after the type of file, like the printer. You can see the printer down here that says the report that was declared down here with the printer *ext. You can specify it if you want, but it's going to be assumed if you don't specify it, it's going to be external. Matter of fact, the only thing you have to specify is if it's not external, you have to put the length of the records. The defaults for the device type, I'm going to talk about that in a lot more detail later because it's one of my favorite features. The fact that we can add the key, and the word keyed stands out now. Not just looking at it for a K in that little column over there, but it's more obvious to everybody now which ones are keyed files. And the file name is no longer limited to 10 characters. So if you've got some funky file names, then in your logic, you want to refer to it as something a little bit nicer, you can do that. You just need to use the ext description keyword to specify the actual name of the file that's to be used at compile time. So those defaults that I talked about that are really useful. I've already said that database files will default, or disk files, as they're known in RPG, of course, will default to usage input. So first of all, they'll default to disk. So if you don't specify what type of file it is, it assumes disk. And because it's disk, it's usage input by default. Printer devices default to output because I don't know about you, but I'm still looking for the printer that will provide input to my RPG program. I haven't found one yet. They only do output. So why did we always have to specify that? Now you don't have to specify it. It says printer. Guess what? It's output. Workstation files are going to default to input output again, because that's almost always what they're going to be. And then also some usage values will imply others. So for example, star update implies input. However, this is one of the sort of gotchas. I've got a list towards the end of some gotchas that just things you want to watch out for because it's a little different from what we're used to. The traditional F-spec star, the update does not imply delete. So if you want to be able to delete, you have to specify both update and delete, which is different from what it was on the traditional F-spec. But if you do specify delete, that implies both input and update. So what I've done in this example here is I've actually shown you three different ways of coding the same thing. So up at the top, we've got the traditional F-spec way of coding it, which we're not going to do anymore, right? And at the bottom, I've shown you two ways of coding each of those F-specs. The first way is coding it completely. That is sort of word for word, or column for column, I guess I should say, of everything that's coded in that F-spec up here is now coded in the F-spec itself. But the second one is showing you what's the minimum amount that I had to specify. So for example, I didn't have to say it was disk. And I didn't have to say it was externally described and things like that. Actually, I should have put externally described right there, shouldn't I? So for that one, I actually forgot that part of the beginning on the first one. So the same thing with the reports. So you get the idea. There is the sort of maximum word for word translation from fixed form, and then there's the minimal translation that is required to provide the same functionality. So that's the nice thing about it, is you can be as wordy or not as you want to be. And as RPGers, we tend to not like to do a lot of keying. So that's pretty cool. Moving on to from the F specs now to the D specs. So for data structures, the XX after the declare is going to be DS for data structure. There is also something that you will probably never see. I don't think I've ever seen it yet in actual real life code, other than just examples that people were providing. It could be declare subfield, SUBF. The reason you hardly ever see this is that the only time you would need it is if the name of the subfield were an opcode name. And while you might think, why would anybody put an opcode name? But I mean, if you think about what some of the opcodes are, read, select, I mean, it could be that in some applications, those would be logical field names or subfield names to be used. And if that's the case, then the RPG compiler, of course, would get confused as to whether you mean the opcode read or whether you mean a subfield called read. So that's the only case where you would need to say declare subfield. I almost said subfile there. A totally different thing. So declare subfield read or select, but otherwise in 99.99% of the time, you're just going to put the name of the thing. As long as it doesn't match an opcode, you'll be able to do that. Notice my my zip code here, the zone field that has 0 decimals. I did also zip plus, which does have 0 decimals as well. So if you want to put the 0 in, you can. But the nice thing is we're no longer required. The thing that I used to really drive me completely crazy in fixed form is that we were required to put 0 decimals when we declared an integer, which by definition can't have any decimals, but yeah, there you go. We also can have standalone fields, so declare -s, and for named constants, it would be declare -c for named constants. Otherwise, the rest of the definitions look very much as what you're seeing here. So let's talk about the data types themselves, because the data types themselves are specified as keywords. They're not just columns, just letters and columns. And this reminds me, because I just saw here for the first time a reference to the notes. If you have not downloaded the handout, I would recommend that you might want to do that, because one thing you don't see here, you haven't seen here, is that for every single chart in this Freeform session, there's a page of notes. Now, sometimes the notes might only be 1 or 2 sentences. In other cases, it has some additional examples, additional code examples, or just more detail about some of the things that I didn't have room for on all the charts. So there is quite a bit more information in the handout than you're going to see. On top of that, there's some extra bonus charts at the very end of the handout that I don't intend to cover at all. And that's from some of the very basic things, like how do we replace some of those opcodes, more details about how we replace some of the opcodes that are no longer supported. So I just wanted to mention that that handout download bit, since that note was on here. So you can see the data types listed in this chart and the Freeform keyword that we would use instead. And in some cases, some comments, including my little do not use comment there. If you want to know more about that, you'll have to get the handout and read that. And actually even includes a link to an article that I wrote on the subject many years ago on what's wrong with binary. Not integers, but binary. There are problems with that. And so you really should switch over to using integers instead. But I digress. One thing I want to point out here is a couple of the changes, like varchar, for example. We used to have just character, and then we used a keyword varying. So that's now changed into a different data type for varchar. And the same thing with dates and times. We used to have the date, and then the format was a completely separate keyword for date format. Now we put date and the format. Now, of course, if you don't put a format in there, it will still default just like it did before if you didn't put the date format keyword. And we've already mentioned about the 0 decimals that aren't required. So here's an example, I think a similar example to the one we've already seen, showing my own personal preferences for alignment. Really, because I always did, I don't know if you did, but I always did with my, even with my fixed form coding way back in the day, I would always sort of indent what I had overlaid parts of the data structure and things like that to show the structure. So we could have done that with the names themselves. Now, of course, we can indent the entire thing. And so it is a little bit nicer from that perspective. One of the other things that is new that we got as of 7.1 with Freeform declarations is the ability to the keyword to say the position within the data structure. So we use this sometimes to in place of overlay. So in the past, we could overlay, and you still can overlay subfields within a data structure. What you cannot do is you cannot overlay the data structure name itself, which is something, it's a sort of a shortcut that some of us used to use, true confessions, myself included. I used to use this little shortcut that says, rather than, say overlay the first subfield, I would just say overlay the data structure. It made logical sense to me, but we can't do that anymore. So instead, what we're going to need to do is say position 1. If you want to overlay the data structure, say starting in position 1. Obviously, you can start the position anywhere you like within the data structure as well, or you can still use the overlay by name of subfield. And there's, again, in the handout, examples of the old way that I did it before to compare to this new way. Now, if you have nested data structures, and if you're not familiar with nested data structures, you're really missing out. So the first way that we had of creating nested data structures was using LikeDS, and it was a little bit complex to try to sift through. wasn't hard to write, I don't think, but it was hard to understand and understand after the fact. If you're going in to try to figure out what's going on here, you have to follow your way through all of the like DSs and their definitions. Now, what we can do is we can actually just code them just like we do our nested logic. We can just code, the highest level divisions, and then inside that we have another data structure for departments, and inside that, which also happens to be a data structure array, as you can see. And then inside that, we have another data structure for products, which also happens to be an array. And so you can now just code that into me. Anyway, this is way more easily understood at a glance. I know now what that data structure looks like. And this is something that I used to almost have to use a piece of paper and, write it down myself in almost this kind of fashion in trying to figure out what was going on. And by the way, I've still got the old word here, RFE, request for enhancements. I should change that to IBM ideas. It's now referred to as IBM ideas. But this is when you can tell IBM you've got a great idea of something they should change. John Paris was the person who put in the request for this ability, and it got in. So proof of the power of asking for what you want. A few more things about data definitions. Constants can now be used. So named constants I'm talking about here. Named constants can be used in more places, including things like field length and decimal places and array dimensions. Just about anywhere you can use an actual literal, you can use a named constant as well. So you can see, for example, in this down here towards the end, I've got digits and decimals defined as constants, and I can use those as my definition. So the nice thing about this is if you have sort of a standard for this program, I want most of my fields to be 7.2, or a lot of them need to be that. And if there's a point at which later on you decide, you know what, those fields need to be bigger. Now I don't have to go change every single one of them to be 9.2. I can actually just change the value of the constant here and think about how much easier that's going to be maintenance wise as we go along. The other thing is a little different here from in the past. If you really got carried away with your long names, and if your name didn't actually fit into the name column in the DSpec, you had to put your little ... at the end. Now you don't do that. Not only do you not need to do that, you cannot do that. So in Freeform declarations, the ... is a no-no. That will produce an error, but then you're never going to need it. I mean, unless your name runs all the way out of the end of the spec line, the whole 92 characters or whatever it is. And I don't think anybody's going to have names that big. So, it's not really needed anymore, but it's also not allowed. So if you are going to manually convert a few lines of code, make sure to take those ellipses out if you've got them. Now, for those of you that are writing procedures and prototypes, well, most everybody's writing prototypes in Freeform because you have to, for reasons we'll talk about in a moment when we get to the logic part. But good for you, first of all, especially if you're doing some procedures. Another one of my favorite subjects. So the declare proc declares a procedure, and an end proc ends the procedure, not too surprisingly, with the name optional at the end. We have the declare PI for the procedure interface, which in the past would have been coded on a DSpec. And the prototypes, again, were coded on DSpecs before. We now have declare PR for our prototypes. For a declare PI, quite often, I would not bother putting the name of the procedure, because the name of the procedure is typically, like it is in this example down here, immediately below, above the procedure interface. And so hey, it's right there. It already says day of week. Why do I have to put day of week here? But we used to just be able to leave it blank. Now we do have to put a placeholder in. So star N says no name. This is a placeholder for the no name procedures. So either put the name in there or put star in. Again, declare parm. You're almost never going to use the declare parm. It's very much like the declare subfield that we talked about with data structures earlier, only if the actual name of the parameter is a valid operation code name, like select or chain or read, something like that. Some examples of what our declare prototypes might look like, and some of the changes there. For programs, you no longer have to put the name. So if it's a program, you don't necessarily have to put the name of the program, assuming that the prototype name is the same. So look at my first two examples here. Q command exec, I put ext pookum. That's going to call, because of course RPG uppercases everything. Your compiler uppercases everything when you compile it. So that's going to be used to call an uppercase Q command exec program. That would be the alternative. The second one is the alternative way of spelling it out as we would have before, where you had to put in the actual name and it had to be in all uppercase. So that's the alternative way of doing it. But if you've got your own program and it's the actual name of the program object instead of renaming it, then you don't have to put the name in there. If for some reason you wanted to rename the program name, which a lot of times people will want to do, then you still have to put the ext program name in, obviously, to specify which program it is you actually want to call. There's also a new option for, relatively new anyway, for calling procedures, which is particularly important if you're calling non-RPG procedures, but even RPG procedures sometimes, which is the declare case. So basically it says, I'm going to, because they are case sensitive. And as I mentioned before, RPG compiler wants to uppercase things. So what this is saying is that the external procedure name is exactly the case as it is declared. So it's all lowercase. So the C function, COS, lowercase is important. If it was COS uppercase, that won't work. So that's basically, you can either code it that way, as we used to, or you can use declare case and just say the way I wrote it in the PI is the way I want it. It is the name as it has to be. Now, I mentioned that there are a few sort of gotchas to look out for. I think I've mentioned most, if not all of these already, but I just wanted to have one place where you can go back and refer to some things that for reference later on. The overlay keyword, remember, can't be used against a data structure name. You can still use overlay with subfields to overlay subfields, just not the data structure itself. So instead you would use position, and in the case of overlaying the data structure name, it would be position 1. Remember that the names in ext name, ext field, and data area must be in quotes, and they are case sensitive. In other words, they're almost always going to be uppercase. Without the quotes, they're going to be treated as variables or constant names. You don't use ellipsis anymore at all when doing data declarations, nor do we need them, but just so you know, they're not allowed. On declaring the files, the U on the fspec used to enable both update and delete, but in Freeform, delete must be explicitly requested if you need that capability. Remember that we need an NDS, end data structure, end prototype, end procedure interface, always required, almost. I think there might be an exception or two here and there. In some cases, they may appear on the same line as the declare. And also one thing that I like to mention is that the RDIs convert all to Freeform really just means convert logic. And even then, it doesn't do a great job of it. And we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail later on. And of course, the INO specs remain in fixed form. So move away from whatever you use an INO specs for today. Find another way. There are other ways to do all those things. And maybe it's a good time to do that. So those are the gotchas. Let's also review the high points here for Freeform declarations. No more free and in free. Yay. That's particularly when you use procedures. It was such a pain to have all those free and in frees everywhere. Intelligent defaults in the file declarations and in the data declarations. The fact that we can now mix our file and data declarations together. And by the way, you can even do that in fixed form. I probably shouldn't mention that because I want everybody to be coding in Freeform, but you know, even in fixed form, you can mix them now as of 7.1. Constants can be used as keyword values. Slash copy and other directives don't have to start in column 7. They can start anywhere. Well, anywhere other than prior to 8, unless you're using * free. The / style of comments can be used everywhere that Freeform is used, including in the declarations. And the default activation group no is optional in many cases if you're using some other ILE keyword. So we've covered * free. We've covered the declarations. Because it's been around so long, I'm making a bold assumption here that most of you are at least familiar with the basics of Freeform logic. So I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. There is a lot more detail, as I mentioned before, some bonus charts at the very end of the handout. If you download the handout, that gives you more detail about some of the logic pieces here. But let me go through the basics of the syntax and a couple of highlights that I want to point out about logic that even if you're doing free format logic, you may not have realized a couple of these things. So starting with v5r1, we had the ability to do freeform logic. Originally, we had to have a /free and /n-free. Starting with 7.1, those are no longer required. Just leave columns 6 and 7 blank. You can mix fixed form and free form, but please, it's so ugly. It's so much better if you can find a way to put everything in free form. But hey, if that's the only thing, because there's these 3 lines of code that you can't figure out how to do in free form, if that's what's keeping you from free form, all right, that's the exception. I'll allow that one. But please don't mix them just because you want to. So the syntax is always opcode first, followed by opcode extender. An opcode extender is something like, you know, read with no lock. Gosh, I can't think of all the other extenders there are out there. But anyway, those kinds of things that go immediately after the opcode in parentheses, if there are any. And then followed by factor1, factor2, and result. You don't have to have a placeholder if there's not almost always. There's 1 or 2 exceptions, but almost always you don't need any kind of placeholder for factor1 or factor2 or result. The compiler can figure out in context, you know, which ones, depending on how many are there, whether it's a factor1 and factor2 or factor1 and result, or, you know, whatever. Your operands are not limited to 14 characters anymore. You do need the semicolon at the end of the line, and not all opcodes are supported. That's probably the biggest stumbling block for a lot of people. 2 opcodes are almost always optional, and that's eval and call p. So you will find that people rarely, when you're coding in freeform, even though you can, it is rarely that you will actually see an eval in the code. Like I've said, eval here, customer error equals true. Most people would code it as the second example, customer error equals, right, without the eval. And the same thing with call p. If you're calling a program with a prototype, you don't have to say call p. You just put the program name and the parameters. A prototype name, I should say, as opposed to program name. So the logic rules, this is pre-V7. Everything needed to be between 8 and 80, but of course now with * free, we can go prior to that. We can go before that and after. Before 8 and after 80. Comments in the past could be in with a asterisk in column 7 or with a / 2 slashes. Most everybody uses the 2 slashes now. There's no way to define fields in logic. Should have got over that bad habit a long time ago. So you're going to have to put those back up in the declare section where we're declaring data. And instead you're going to, and resulting indicators are no longer used. And instead we're going to use the built-in functions, things like %found, %EOF, %error. So much easier to read and understand than figuring out which one of the 3 resulting indicators is that and what does it mean. And oh man, I'm glad those days are over. For me, anyway, they're over. So that's great. Some of you may have heard, oh, but embedded SQL isn't supported. It's been supported since V504, so that's not an excuse anymore. So just showing an example here of doing that with that SQL. So our free format logic, again, we saw a similar kind of thing before, just showing you how you can indent the logic, showing you how you can put the end of line comments in here. We don't need the /free and end free anymore as of 7.1. We don't use the eval. So down here in the subroutine, the calc dividend subroutine, we omitted the eval on the first eval operation. Just said total sales equals. We needed though the eval on the second one because that's the one I was trying to remember earlier, the half adjust. I knew there was one very common opcode extender that just wasn't coming to mind. The half adjust on the eval. Because of the half adjust, now we have to code the eval. You can't just put the H there all by itself. Otherwise, you'll typically omit the eval. Excuse me. And the record transaction here, that's actually a call P. So I mentioned before that the call P is optional as well. Now this chart and the next one is a list of the opcodes and how to replace them. Opcodes, excuse me. John, I could use a little water if you're listening in. I usually have water next to me, but I forgot to get it this time. So this chart and the next one are the obsolete opcodes, or deprecated is the term that's used in most other environments. So these are things that we can't use in Freeform anymore. Stumbling blocks for a lot of people, some of them, but they're all very easily replaced, some more easily than others, I'll admit. So this is the first page, here's the second page. Don't intend to go through any of these other than the ones that are in follow-on charts. So thank you very much, John. John's come to my rescue. So the kinds of opcodes that are not supported in Freeform logic are the old-fashioned ones, like the things with EQ and GT and all that kind of stuff on the end, and go to, heaven forbid. Ones where new support is provided, where existing support, even if it's not 100% identical, is provided with expressions, combination of enhanced and new support, and the ones that compiler writers don't like. Maybe that's not the best way to say it, but let's face it, they saw it a chance to get rid of something that really didn't work well in the language. And so that's what happened with move left, and move array. For those of you that are saying, but I love move. What's wrong with move? What's wrong with move is that it tells you what to do, but it doesn't say anything about what's going on. So if you take a look at the move, the first move here, what does it do? It moves data. But does it copy the data byte for byte? Does it change the data type? Does it truncate the data? Does it concatenate two fields? Does it, oh, heaven forbid, discard high order digits without any warning whatsoever? If the numeric field is a smaller length. The same thing with moving dates. It's so generic. It's too generic. Now you might say to yourself, well, isn't eval just, because eval is pretty much the replacement, but isn't eval just as generic? No, because with eval, if I wanted to eval one data type to another, I'd have to use a built-in function to specify how I wanted that behavior to work, right? How I want the move to happen. So I am converting this from numeric to character, for example. I put that in by specifying %char. So all of those kind of things, it makes your code more obvious. You don't have to go and look at all the definitions of all the parameters used and then try to figure out what's going to happen as a result of this. You see an eval, and the eval, with or without built-in functions, you know what's going to happen. And that's really important for maintenance. Now, a few things that are new to free and can only be used in Freeform. The first one is there's a couple of different key options. So if you have a keyed file, how do you specify the keys? Well, we now have a KDS, a key data structure, which is pretty cool. The nice thing about it is that it allows you to specify just one data structure. And even if you want a partial key, you don't need another data structure to specify that. You can just sort of say, like K-list, you can just sort of say, well, I want just the first two. So that's of the product keys down here. You can specify the number of fields in the key data structure you want to use. So this is really cool, but I have to confess that I don't use this one very often, because my personal preference for most uses is the second key option, and that is to actually specify the values that I want to use for the keys in parentheses following the chain or the setLL operation code, right? So the nice thing about this is that one nice thing is that I don't have to move data to any specific field like the key data structure fields. These don't have to be the actual names of the fields in the file or the columns in the file table. I'll get my terminology right in a moment. The columns in the table. So basically I can, as long as they are of the right base type, data type, this works just fine. And I don't have to worry about specifying whether I only want the first two of the keys. I just specify two of them. So this I think is really great. I can even put in, hard-coded values in there, as well as constants and things like that. So one thing that I didn't learn until fairly recently is that there's a difference between, let's say there's only one key field. It's a difference between whether you put it in parentheses or not. If you have multiples, you need to put it in parentheses, but if there's only one, there is a difference. If you don't put it in parentheses, it's going to require an exact match of the attributes for the field. Same length, exact data type, and all of that. Whereas if you put it in parentheses, it's more forgiving, shall we say, in that it just needs to be the same sort of base type. It needs to be numeric, but if you put it in packed and the other one is zoned, they'll figure that out. So nice way of doing that. When you're doing updates, another really nice thing that's only available in Freeform is the % fields built in. To specify, we can say, these are the specific fields I want to update. So you don't, that's one of the reasons people use OSPEC sometimes, section output. Now you can do it this way as well for some of those occasions. And one last thing, and this isn't, I confess, this isn't really truly related to Freeform specifically, because you can do this in fixed form as well. But I find people who code in Freeform are more likely to use this, so I thought I'd throw it in here for those of you who may not be that using a lot of Freeform right now. And that is the shortcut to be able to say plus equals for add or minus equals for subtract, as well as, of course, multiply and divide work as well, but just aren't used nearly as often. Be very careful that you don't switch them the wrong way. So if you say equal plus, that's saying move this positive value to the field on the left-hand side, the receiving field. But if you say plus equal, it says add one. So that's the difference here. As I mentioned to you before, you've probably got a lot of code out there. I hope not, but I'm sure if you're in this session, you've probably got some code out there that isn't Freeform already. Don't convert it manually yourself. You have better things to do with your time. RDI has a convert to Freeform. If the code is already fairly modern, if it's relatively recent code, the convert all for logic will work reasonably well. But if it's got a lot of moves and move lefts, will do very little for you for those kind of things. And it doesn't do anything for the declarations. So not a really great option. The Help Systems RPG Toolbox has a really good solution. It used to be called Anoma Software before they became part of Help Systems. Their RPG Toolbox has a really good Freeform conversion that I've used a lot. It will take you all the way from old RPG 400, even prior to LE, all the way to Freeform at one fell swoop if you want to. And you can control, various aspects of what it's going to do there. So it's really quite nice. And it has an RDI plugin as well. Arcade software also has a transformer RPG that can converts entire members to Freeform, including the Freeform declarations. There's an RDI plugin. And the cool thing about this one is that it even converts some go-to logic, which is pretty hairy stuff to try to convert, let me tell you. So if you got a lot of go-tos, the ArcAD transformer might be a really good option for you. There's an open source set of tools from Craig Rutledge. Look at JCR commands for his free tool sets related to that. And there's also an RDI plugin that utilizes some of Craig's tooling. And if you're using VS Code, code for IBMI or otherwise, using VS Code, there is RPGLE free. Brian Garland has written an extension to do freeform declarations. It does a pretty decent job as well within VS Code. So so that works well as the other tools that I talked about. Excuse me. And of course, Merlin, of course, from IBM is a newly announced IDE, and it contains some free format conversion facilities as well. I've got a chart later on for where you can get with links to all those different tools if you want to know that. So don't you have to put you don't have to put all those questions in the Q&A right now. This is just an example of this happens to be Help Systems RPG Toolbox. And an example of how it converts the code from the after and before. I guess maybe I could have put it the other way around for before and after, but there you go. So it doesn't always align things the way I like. So I usually go in and do a few little tweaks on my own. I mean, if you're picky, you can do some of those kind of things. But and whatever tool you use, you're probably going to have a few things that you may want to do on your own or format it otherwise. Like, for example, in VS Code, there's the ability to use a linter that will sort of automatically reformat some of this kind of stuff for you. So that's kind of cool. And one last thing, you're not going to do this in SEU. I mean, you really shouldn't try to do this in SEU because SEU was not updated after free format declarations came in. Free format logic, yes, although it doesn't understand all the new opcodes and built-in functions, so you're still going to have a problem. But especially with the free format declarations, look what SEU does with that. It's a mess. I've had people say, yeah, but I can just turn off syntax checking, to which I say, that's the one thing that SEU did for me was syntax checking. And you want to turn that off. Use a better editor. My personal preference, I'm an RDI user myself, mostly, but there are other great solutions like VS Code for IBMI, Merlin, My Workplace. I mean, there are other options, all of which are better than this one. So enough said. Lots of places where you can learn more about some of the things we've talked about, including those tools, conversion tools. I want to call your attention particularly to this. There's a 5-part series that John Paris wrote on the Geezer's Guide to Free Format RPG. So for those of us who've been doing RPG for decades, this is a great series to go into a lot of detail, a lot of code examples, comparing old and new and what the advantages are of the new ways of doing things. So I'd really like to encourage you to take a look at those things. As I mentioned before, there's some extra handout materials, so I didn't go into much detail on how to convert move and move left and stuff like that. But there's some charts in the handout. So if you want more of that, or you can just go read John's series of articles, that covers it quite well as well. So other ways you can get that information that I didn't have time to go over. I'm looking forward to seeing many of you are already signed up for the Summit Deep Dive workshops. And any of you who haven't signed up yet, I hope maybe you might consider that. Now, if you want to know more about what's going to be included in those deep dive workshops, then just hold on for a couple of minutes. John's going to come down and join me. John and I are going to do a joint session on the skills that are required, essential skills for modern RPG applications. So Freeform, this is the end of the Freeform portion of this session, but another few minutes we'll be talking about the Freeform declarations. Now I will need just a minute or two to get John down here and positioned into the camera's face as well. And so if you want to get up and take a little stretch break for just a minute or two, John and I will get ready to dive in for the essential skills for today's RPG developers.
There now. I've been wearing my little fingers out answering questions.
Wow. Okay.
Let's just make sure that there aren't any. What's the next? There it is. There aren't any new ones coming. No, good. Oh, good.
You've done a good job.
I actually caught up with them.
I want to go through and read those questions. I'm curious to see what sort of things people still need to know about Freeform. You think by now people would have actually got it all.
No.
I have to confess, I still learn a few new things from time
There was
to time,
one in there that I had never thought of.
Oh, cool. All right. Okay. So we wanted to offer this to give you more details on the workshops, but also the reasons for the workshops. So I'm going to let John lead off this discussion.
You are? Okay. You're going to be pressing the buttons.
I'll press the buttons.
Okay, you press the buttons. Okay, let's press the first button then. We're going to talk about essential skills for today's developers, basically. And
so far, I'm going to press the button correctly. There we go.
There we
got
go.
it now.
Okay, so basically, this is what
I went too far.
Susan's
Sorry.
gone too far.
I'm
There we
sorry.
go.
I skipped a chart.
All right.
Excuse me.
So basically, I thought it looked wrong. Basically, Freeform RPG, which is what we've just been covering, it's just the beginning. And if you're going to be writing applications for today, you're going to require more skills. There are modern RPG practices, including new ways of data definition, using sub-procedures and service programs and things like this that maybe you don't have those skills in-house yet. The database is becoming more and more and more important. You may have noticed in recent announcements from IBM, every time there is an announcement, there are a host of new SQL services that replace the old, rather clumsy APIs that we used to have to use to find information. We've got ever more powerful IDEs now. Susan and I have been using RDI, for example, since before it was RDI. It was Code 400 and then WDSC. I also use VS Code with the Code for AI plugin. And these are very powerful tools. And frankly, they make me one heck of a lot more productive than I ever was with SEU. So that's a skill you need to have. Open source. Now, why do we care about open source? We care about open source, because IBM do. And if they think it's important enough to spend the amount of money on it that they have, then we ought to be paying attention. But we'll talk about some of the more detailed reasons when we get to that bit. But the idea here is that these Summit Deep Dive workshops can help you get the skills you need to get started down these roads. So let's start with modern RPG practices. Well, Freeform's the foundation. If you don't have that, then you really can't exploit the majority or a very large percentage of the new RPG features. You need to move towards an API-oriented architecture. That is to say that your code be callable from anywhere by anybody. So the days when a customer wanted to communicate with you and would do so by phoning you, or in the super advanced technologies would send you a CSV file. I'm sorry, that's just ancient history. Now they need to be able to call you. They want a web service that they can call to get the information that they need. And procedures and service programs are essential components in this. You need to upgrade your data handling skills too. I mentioned earlier about this, but defining and using dynamic arrays, data structure arrays, templates, etc., to handle JSON and XML and other data types within your RPG, you're going to need this kind of stuff. And because RPG arrays in particular was so, well, to be polite, primitive for so many years, most of us never really got our heads around using them properly. And I'll talk more about this when I talk about open source stuff in a minute.
If you think you know data structures and arrays, but haven't really dived into what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years, you don't know
Yeah.
data structures and arrays. And
Like, actually, I mean, I'd go further back than that. I mean, there's a lot of stuff happened in the last 5 years, 10 years even, that a lot of people don't know about. And I think a lot of it is just because we came to ignore arrays. We
Right.
there were just some, we used work files. We didn't use arrays in RPG because
that's why we did it.
because arrays were so useless, basically.
Yeah.
You also need to get into using the power of SQL. There's too many old programs laying around there where there has, set-ll read chain loops to retrieve what are basically sets of data. And embedded SQL, utilizing views, etc., is so much better for that kind of thing, so much more powerful. So what are the workshops related to this? Well, I've got one on data structure and arrays. Imagine that. So we'll talk all about the dynamic arrays and all of the new stuff that's been added in recent years. Susan here is going to do her procedures and service programs by example. And the by example is the critical bit there, because she literally takes you step by step through the process of building your first procedures and then your first service programs and how to maintain them, etc., etc. Paul and I are doing API enablement with web services, so how to build them and consume them. And then for embedded SQL, Paul is doing the A to Z of embedded SQL in RPG. So he'll be going over all the refinements, if you like, of how to embed SQL, what the limitations are, how to best do it, etc. And Paul will also be doing one on coding a modern RPG application. We find it's often a good idea, if you are thinking about doing new stuff or rebuilding an app from scratch, you need to know the modern thinking on how to build an RPG application. So this one isn't oriented towards, okay, let's take my existing monolith and modernize it a bit. This one is, how should you have built it in the first place? And therefore, how can you build new apps? And how can you take and rebuild an app? And what should you be aiming at?
And then, of course, there's database. Our resident database expert, of course, is Paul Toohey on the team. And so Paul will be talking a lot more. I'm sure you've all heard about Paul doing his thing with the SQL language. Essential language skills for SQL is just to know the language itself. Obviously, that's the base. But then, of course, utilizing it within programs, as John's already mentioned, Paul's going to be doing one specifically on embedding SQL in RPG programs. The other thing is that a lot of people don't realize that a modern database is more than just about tables and columns. It's about constraints and indices and views, lots and lots of views. Paul is a big views fan, and you'll hear a lot about views and how important they are in some of the workshops that he does. He also has workshops to talk about migrating definitions from DDS to DDL and how you can do do it in such a way so that your existing programs don't have to completely be rewritten or modified. And you also need to think about including some logic. We talked about logic, having your RPG logic callable from anywhere. Well, anywhere might include SQL, because there is an SQL call statement that can call logic. Now, that logic might be written in SQL procedure language, and you can learn that. That's a good skill to learn. But they also can be written in RPG. So you could actually, one way to call an RPG program is from an SQL statement. And so our workshops that we have, that I shouldn't say we have, Paul has, in this particular category are all Paul's sessions.
Because he won't let us talk about SQL.
Well, I wouldn't want to, I tell you, he does a better job.
Doesn't want to risk it.
Getting to a modern database. That's the one that talks about the DDS to DDL kinds of things and DDL itself. Foundations in SQL, that's if you want to learn the actual SQL language itself and some of the details and all the whys and wherefores. And I could probably use a lot of that myself, to be honest, because I know a lot about, I don't know about that much of SQL, and there's that much to know. Embedded SQL specifically, putting it inside your RPG programs, and SQL procedures, functions, and triggers, and how those work and how they can be used and why to use them. Why put that logic into the database rather than rely on RPG programs directly for all of that kind of stuff. And one of my other favorite topics in the world is about IDEs. So our development environments that we work in. Green screens are just totally inadequate for editing this modern code. SEU hasn't been updated in 15 years. New developer recruits are going to expect something a little different, something a lot different from SEU green screens. Luckily, we have not just one, but multiple excellent alternatives for that are perfectly customized for IBMI. And specifically, the ones that are most popular are RDI and Code for IBMI using Microsoft's VS Code and the Code for IBMI extension for that. So I'll be talking about RDI. These are both beginner workshops. I want to point that out. So, you know, if you've been using RDI for decades and you want to know some little nitpicky detail about something, this may not be the workshop for you. But you might pick up a few things, but just keep in mind it is basic. Both of these are actually basic. So getting started with RDI, if assuming this is targeted toward people who are primarily green screen users, and similarly, those people that are green screen users or perhaps RDI users but maybe frustrated or RDI users. In some cases, the one about Code for IBMI, is it right for you? So those are two half-day workshops available that John and myself are going to be doing.
Okay, and last but not least, by any stretch of the imagination, open source. My number one point here is that everyone should learn a new language. If you only know RPG and CL and maybe you've done some SQL, learn a new one. Learn something else. Learn Node.js, learn Python, learn PHP. Even if there's no obvious immediate need, apart from anything else, it's going to teach you to write better RPG code. I mentioned earlier about arrays in RPG. I completely rethought my usage of arrays in RPG after I started coding in PHP. It also made it far more obvious to me why I should write in procedures, why I should break my logic down into smaller and smaller pieces. Became much more obvious. The other thing about this is that you can do so, and you can do this on your home PC or on your work PC. You don't have to, you know, obviously IBM have spent a lot of money enabling this to work on the IBM I, but you don't have to have it running on the IBM I in order to use it. And in fact, with the new ODBC drivers, you don't even have to have it on IBM I at all. You can still write Node or Python or whatever code and access the IBM I database on the back end. There's a number of different ways in which you can help use these tools. You can help you to modernize your IBM I apps. For example, if you want to get more deeply into browser type technology, if you want to do more web services and things like this, there's a lot of tooling out there that can help you that's based around these open source languages. Also, new programmers. One of the big things we get from a lot of clients is I'm having trouble recruiting new programmers. And what they really mean is I'm having trouble recruiting RPG programmers. And what we keep telling them is then switch to Freeform RPG and just recruit programmers. Those new people will help address your skill shortages because they'll learn RPG in Freeform very, very quickly. And they can help with the skill shortage. They'll also help you with modernizing your applications because they have skill sets in the areas that you may well be lacking within your existing RPG and CL universe. You can also use open source packages to fill gaps in your software inventory. For example, we had no end of problems trying to use IBM's SMTP server to send out emails. So in actual fact, the emails that you received when you registered for this seminar did not come from the normal IBM SMTP. Rather, they were from an open source PHP package, because that interface is much better and more simply with Amazon than with Gmail servers than trying to do it with the SMTP setup. So we've also used other open source packages for other purposes. So there's a lot of ways you can fill gaps in your software inventory just by adopting these new languages. The relevant workshops, all of these are led by our friend Mikey Pavlak. And Mike will be doing an intro to open source. That is to say, he'll be talking about why it's important, where IBM have invested, how you get hold of the stuff, how you install it, etc. Because IBM do now supply install processes for all of this stuff, and it is a much simpler way of dealing with it than it used to be.
He'll also talk a lot about terminology, because that's where I fall down a lot. Is IBM provides a lot of documentation, but using words that I don't understand as a traditional RPG IBMI person.
Yeah. So in addition, because Python and PHP have so far proven the biggest open source languages that have been adopted on IBM I. PHP's been around longer, but Python is gaining rapidly in popularity. And it might interest you to know that one of the reasons for that is that Python is very frequently used for scripting processes in a much more powerful and easier way than you can do with PHP, with CL. I'll get my English right eventually. So Python is a great language to use as well.
So we hope that you'll join us. Those know that many of you are already signed up for the deep dive workshops, but if you're not, a little more detail about the workshops themselves. We're designed this to enhance your skills quickly. So we've talked about the skills that we feel are essential for today's RPG developers. Half-day workshops on each of these topics, interactive live instructions. So we're actually going to be there. We'll be able to answer your questions live. Well, hopefully answer them all, but certainly listen to all your questions live and in person. But they are also recorded. So for those people who, something came up and you just couldn't make it, or your time zone isn't suitable for watching the live class, you can always look at the recording as well. So it's easy to schedule every other work that you're doing. As you've seen with I think you already saw an example in some of my Freeform code, Freeform presentations, a lot of code examples. We're big on code examples of all this stuff. So that's the kind of thing you'll have. There's quantity and group discounts. So it applies to the total number of workshops attended by an individual or a group within a company. So whether it's, say, 10 people each attending one workshop, you'll get the 6-person or greater discount. Or if it's one person attending 10 workshops, you'll get the same discount. So that works either way. And our super saver rates are still available until July 31st.
Okay, well, with that, we're going to wrap up the recorded portion of this. We will shut off the recording at this time, but Susan and I will be here and keep the session running for a couple of minutes, in part because we've seen that there are some additional questions that have shown up. And so we'll take a quick look at those and get some answers into the system before we close this down. Thanks all for joining us, from me and from
Me.
Okay.
From Canada.
Yes. Oh, Canada. Anyway, okay. Thanks for joining us today, guys. Bye now.
Bye.